Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be sharing 10 of my absolute favorite completed fantasy romance series. Alright guys, so I've had a lot of requests to do this video, and I figured now was the perfect time. So I have 10 completed fantasy romance series or duologies on this list, so that way these series are very easily bingeable, you don't have to wait for the last book to come out, and overall I love all of these series so much and I'm so excited to talk about them with you. Now if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about these fantasy romance series. Starting off with YA fantasy romance, I had to include Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. So this was the first series that SJM ever put out. And I actually read this after I read A Court of Thorns and Roses. And while the first two books did feel very YA, after you hit Heir of Fire, this series is incredible. You're not going to miss the spice. There's so much action. This has some of my absolute favorite characters of any fantasy romance I've ever read. There are relationships in here that I am absolutely obsessed with, so I highly recommend picking this up. I'm going to be honest with you, it has been years since I've read this series, and I don't exactly remember what happens in this first book and like what we know and what we don't know. So this is going to be a very, very vague plot summary. But we are following Selena Sardathian, and she is a really good assassin, and she is forced to compete in these like gladiator type games. And while doing so, she befriends some people in the kingdom and finds out that there's a lot of things amiss, and it goes from there. That's the best I can do, guys. I'm really sorry. I really don't remember when we're told things throughout the series. But like I said, once you hit Heir of Fire, this series is absolutely fantastic. So if you have not checked out Throne of Glass yet, I highly recommend picking it up. And next up is a YA fantasy romance duology. So we have These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan. I actually have a full spoiler-free book review of this first book that I'll leave in the cards and in the description. I don't think I did one for the second book, but I really enjoyed the duology as a whole. This duology has a lot of similar tropes to A Court of Thorns and Roses, so if that's a series you really enjoy, I think you will like this duology. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the plot, we are following Bree, and Bree lives in a world where people can make deals with the Fae. However, doing that and making a deal with the Fae normally comes at a very heavy cost. So Bree wants to avoid that whenever possible. Unfortunately, Bree's younger sister ends up being kidnapped by a Fae from the Unseelie Court. So Bree then has to travel to the Fae world, where she meets the prince of the Seelie Court and some misfits from the Unseelie Court, and they try to work together to find her sister. So, like I said, I absolutely love this. I will say the second book had a lot going on. This probably could have been a 3-book series, and the pacing would have been a little bit less, like, rushed. But overall, I highly recommend, and this is one of my favorite fantasy romance duologies. And last up for YA fantasy romance, we have Kingdom of the Wicked by Kerri Maniscalco. So this is part of a 3-book series. The third and final book came out September of last year. So the series is completed, and this is kind of like a witchy fantasy romance. It also has like enemies to lovers vibes. I really enjoyed this first book. So we are following Amelia, and she is a witch who is living amongst humans in secret, and one day someone very close to her is brutally murdered. So she decides she's gonna find out who committed the crime, and she realizes that to help her figure out what's going on, she has to summon a demon from hell. So she ends up summoning the Prince of Hell, Wrath, and the story goes from there. They absolutely hate each other, but they have to work together because of the summoning spell, and this was really enjoyable. A lot of angst, a lot of just like moments that are them screaming at each other that then turns to them almost kissing, like that happens a few times throughout this book. So overall, I absolutely love this, and if you're a fan of YA fantasy romance and you're looking for like a witchy vibe, definitely pick this series up. And next up is one of my absolute favorite fantasy romance duologies, and it is A King So Cold by Ella Fields. This duology is spectacular. If you're a fan of dark romance and you like it a little bit darker and you like really, really strong heroines, I highly recommend picking this duology up if you haven't yet. So the story is following Audra, and at the start of the book, she is the queen of this kingdom, and she's known as being very merciless and like almost wicked. And at the start of this, there is a neighboring army that is about to invade. And we also find out that Audra's husband, who you'd assume would be like the king of her people, is wandering around with no memory of who he is or that he was ever even married to Audra. And we also find out that Audra absolutely loathes him with every fiber of her being, and we're not exactly sure why. So throughout this book, we kind of find out what caused Audra to become the Wicked Queen she is known to be. So it's kind of like a villain origin story, but also like you totally understand Audra's motivations and what led her to become the way she is. And I loved this duology. I will say this first book, really, really good. Second book, I prefer it a little bit more, but also know the second book is much darker than this first one. So definitely check trigger warnings. There is a love triangle, and it's probably one of the best love triangles I've read because I had no idea who Audra was going to go for. But yeah, I love this duology. So if you're looking for a completed fantasy romance duology, look no further, pick up A King So Cold. All right, so this next fantasy romance duology is very dark. I'm not going to say it's one of my favorites, but it is a fantasy romance duology that I think about fairly often because of how interesting it was. So it's called A King of Flesh and Bone. We are following our main character, and she lives in a world where corpses reanimate because the King of Flesh and Bone put a curse on her people. So instead of the dead being buried, they kind of just like pop back up and wander around. So there's really no rest for the dead. And obviously this isn't great for the human people because there are a bunch of corpses just like walking around. So our main character is trying to, I think, bury one of these corpses, and she ends up tangled in the straps of a zombie donkey who then takes her to the King of Flesh and Bone. So when the King of Flesh and Bone sees this human in the Deadlands, he's like, oh man, she's really not supposed to be here, but I'm a maker mine and she's gonna be my plaything, and yay. So he takes her into his kingdom where he pretty much kind of tortures her and treats her abysmally, including breaking both of her legs multiple times and never apologizing. And we're just following our main character as she tries to survive through all of this. So I will say throughout the duology, it's very much our main character slowly becoming a villain instead of the King of Flesh and Bone getting any sort of redemption. Like, he stays evil pretty much the entire time. So just know that going in. Personally, it wasn't really for me, but I did have a lot of fun reading it. So if that sounds like something you might be into, definitely pick up King of Flesh and Bone. And the rest of the books on this list are all completed adult fantasy romance series. So first up, we have A Kingdom of Stars and Shadows by Holly Renee. I'm going to be honest, I've only read the first two books because the third book isn't available via audio, but if you're reading it physically, this series is completed. So we are following Adara, and she was born with this birthmark that designates her as being star-blessed. So what that means is her blood is very powerful for the Fae. If they drink their blood, or her blood, they essentially get a power-up. So when Adara is born with this birthmark, her mother promises the Queen of the Fae that her daughter, when she comes of age, will marry the Prince of the Fae. So Adara really has no choice when she comes of age. She is forced to go to the Fae realms, despite the fact that she does not want to be there. And she's engaged to the Prince of the Fae, who obviously turns out to be not the best guy. And she soon becomes very attracted to the general of the guard, who we then find out is actually the prince's brother. And it goes from there. So there's a little bit of a love triangle. Overall, this had a lot of references to like ACOTAR, not references, it had a lot of similarities to ACOTAR and like those Fae romances that I really enjoy. However, the last third of this book is just smut, and I don't really know why we made that choice. So I love really spicy books. It just feels like it wasn't super spicy until that point, and then it was just nonstop spice. And I was kind of getting over it. Like, I wanted to see what was going to happen in the story because I did really enjoy the story. So overall, didn't love this first book. I do think the second book was a little bit better in terms of pacing. I really like the second book, and I like where the story is going. So I really hope I enjoy the third book in this series and just end it on like a happy note. But overall, if you're looking for a very spicy fantasy romance series that is completed, check out A Kingdom of Stars and Shadows. And next up is The Bonds That Tie by Bree. This is one of my absolute favorite paranormal, wide shoes fantasy romance series. It is so good. If you're unfamiliar with the plot of Bonds That Tie, we are following Oleander, and in Oleander's world, people have bonded, and these bonded are essentially your partners, but by being bonded to them, you actually increase each other's power. So at the start of the story, we are following Oleander, and she's with her mom, and her mom's too bonded. And then there is a horrible car crash, and Oleander is the only survivor. Now, typically, Oleander would go to find her bonded because that is where you are the safest, but instead she ends up fleeing and actually runs from her bonded. So for 5 years, her bonded are searching for Oleander, and they finally find her and they bring her back, and that is really where this first book starts. So this first book is very much like a bully romance because the bonded are like really not okay with the fact that Oleander just ran away from them. But then after that, we kind of get to figure out what's really going on, what motivations Oleander had for fleeing, and it is so good and super spicy after you get into like the second book, and I absolutely loved all of the bonded. My favorite is probably Nox and North, but overall they all had very distinct personalities, and you're gonna fall in love with all of them. So highly recommend if you're looking for a spicy Why Choose fantasy romance, and this series is completed. And next up, we have Lady of Darkness. So once again, I'm going to be honest, I have not completed this series. I've only read the first book because at the time that I read the first book, there was only one book available via audio. And it's been a while, so I have to reread this before I go back and listen to the rest of the audiobooks. But either way, the series is completed, and I really enjoyed this first book. We're following Scarlet, and she is an assassin and is owned by the Assassin Lord and forced to kill people that he chooses. Now, Scarlet does something that angers the Assassin Lord, and he forces her to go live in this nobleman's house, kind of like a timeout, like as a punishment. And while there, she meets someone that might be able to help her get revenge against the Fae Fire Prince, who she harbors a lot of hate towards. And the story goes from there. There's also children that are missing, and we're trying to figure out who's taking them, and a bunch of other things going on. But overall, I very much enjoyed this first book. It had the perfect mix of like politics and then action, but then also a really like slow burn relationship that reminded me a lot of Cass and Poppy from Blood and Ash. So highly recommend if you are looking for a new fantasy romance that I don't hear talked about very often. And next up, we have A Court of Blood and Bindings by Lisette Marshall. Now, I have talked about this series in numerous videos. It is one of my new favorite fantasy romances. I will say I have not read the third book yet because it is yet to be released via audio. I don't think it's coming out till later this year, which is a bit of a bummer. But the series is completed if you just want to read it physically. It's 3 full-length books and then a novella. So if you're unfamiliar with the plot of A Court of Blood and Bindings, we are following Emmeline. Now, Emmeline lives on a human island that is surrounded by Fae islands. Now, the Fae rule the humans because the Fae possess color magic. So what that means is they can look at an item and then pull the color from said item. So if you want to use destruction magic, you pull from red. If you want to use healing magic, you pull from white, or you can mix those colors together and create completely unique magic. Now, the Fae are ruled over by the Mother, who is like the top queen of all of the Fae. She's very ruthless, everyone fears her. And right under her is the Silent Death, who is this Fae essential shadow daddy, think Rhysand, that kills everyone that she asks, so he's feared by everyone. So one day, our main character, Emmeline, wakes up, her entire community is on fire, and standing over her is the Silent Death himself. And she thinks she's about to die, and the story goes from there. So we also find out that the Silent Death is unable to use his voice, so he actually writes everything he needs to communicate down on paper until Emmeline, our main character, teaches him how to use sign language. And I was just obsessed with our male main character. Think Rhysand, but like more endearing. I don't know. I just absolutely love Creon. He is my favorite character by far. But highly recommend if you are looking for a new fantasy romance that is spicy and just you're going to be obsessed with their relationship. Definitely check this series out. And last up, we have Daughter of New Worlds by Carissa Broadbent. This is another completed series. I have only read the first book. Are you noticing a trend here? So I have not finished this series. However, it is completed. I have a lot of friends that have read it and really enjoyed it. So if you like a lot of world building, a lot of politics, a lot of action, I would definitely check this series out. I think Carissa Broadbent is slowly becoming like the new Sarah J. Maas. Amazing writer, really enjoyed this. We are following Tisana. And at the start of this, Tisana is sold at a very young age to be a slave, and she is forced to perform performative magic in order to earn money, hoping to eventually be able to buy her freedom. So when she goes to the person that I guess technically owns her and asks for her freedom, he refuses, there's an altercation, and she's able to flee. So she flees to this like government magical organization and asks for their help in freeing all of her people that are still enslaved back in her like home country. And they refuse, but they say if she joins their cause, then maybe they will help her. So she ends up having to train under this guy. I'm pretty sure his name is Max. Reminded me a lot of General Mustang from Full Metal Alchemist. Ends up training under him, and then a romance starts to blossom, and it goes from there. So overall, the only thing I didn't love about this was the romance. I feel like it was I just didn't buy their romance. I don't know. I just needed it to be a little bit more more flirting. I didn't love the romance, but everything else in terms of story, in terms of what happens throughout this book. There's some very upsetting events that took place. I cried multiple times while reading this first book. I actually am very excited to go back and finish this series because I want to see what happens. But overall, definitely check this out. Also check out Serpent and the Wings of Night. I didn't include that series on this list because I know there are more books coming out, but I think Serpent and the Wings of Night and Ashes and the Star-Crossed King are actually like a duology, and she's just releasing more books in that world, but I'm not positive. So let me know in the comments if you know if it's completed or not. But anyway, definitely check out Carissa Broadbent's work. All of her books have been amazing. All right, guys, those are some of my favorite completed fantasy romance series. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of the series that I mentioned. And I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!